So like Brian mentioned today, I would be focused on the type of work that we are doing in the field of academic bullying and harassment. So a very simple definition I can make for academic bullying is that it's a violation of human rights in an academic setting. And it's important to note that it's not only affect targets, but also affects the scientific integrity as a whole. There are many behaviors that are being considered as workplace bullying, which I listed them here. But when we talk about academic bullying, we also talk about additional contextual behaviors like giving unfair recommendation or threatening a person over their career or their basically visa status if they are international students. And at the institutional level, bullying means covering up for a perpetrator and basically leave targets unhealed and basically provide limited options to the targets of academic bullying and harassment. The unfortunate reality is that academic bullying is an age-old issue. If we go back to Einstein's days, when he basically proposed his ideas on general relativity, there were hundreds of people that out of prejudice and denial gathered together and wrote a book ridiculing Einstein's ideas. And Einstein's reaction to that was that if I were wrong, then one author would have been okay, why 100? So I think he was pointing out to the issue of mobbing or ganging up against a target in an unethical manner, which is one of the sophisticated version of academic bullying and harassment which we witness today. And all the way, if we look at the recent example of Eric Lander, his basically resignation from White House because of the allegations of bullying in basically his career. So now the question is that if we have that issue for a long time in academic setting, why we can't address that? What are the root causes of academic bullying? So the very first reason is that our research, unfortunately, is set up in a way that bullies can thrive in such situation. And even worse, some of them can use bullying behaviors as a tactic to get to the top and be a famous scientist in an unethical way. The other issue we encounter is the lack of robust educational system about academic bullying and harassment. Many people easily justify their behaviors as academic freedom and academic norm. Yet there is a big difference between academic freedom, academic norm, and academic bullying and harassment. So we lack such education. The other issue we have is the huge emphasis on academic index, on impact factor, on number of publication, on number of citations. And there's a great quote from Goodhart, which says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this is one of the major problems that we have in science. Many scientists, at least substantial amount of scientists, see metrics as a goal, as an academic goal, rather than a measure. The other issue we have is the helpless nature of targets. So we have a unique power differentials at academic setting. The other problem is that perpetrators bring substantial amount of funding to the universities, and because universities get paid by them, they have less intentions to basically fairly and unbiasedly consider the issue of academic bullying and harassment. And the last but not least is the lack of insight on the long-term effects of academic bullying and harassment. For example, recently Duke University got fined by NIH for over $100 million because of the data falsification in clinical trials, which bullying was at the very base of it. So one major question that we always encounter is that what is academic freedom? and what is academic bullying, and what are the differences between those. As we all can basically expect, academic freedom means the freedom of basically debating intellectual ideas or works in a way that no one basically attacks the other person's integrity. So we can basically have freedom over research topics and any conclusions that we want to make out of that particular research topic. For example, I always mention that my research interest is in nanomedicine and regenerative medicine. And that's why Michigan State University hired me. But they don't prevent me from studying academic bullying and harassment. So this is basically academic freedom. I'm using my academic freedom. Academic bullying, on the other hand, has totally different set of contextual behaviors and actions. For example, stealing academic credits, or for example, using coercive controls over a person or an employee, or doing mobbing actions, like I mentioned, ganging up against a person, which is an indirect way of retaliation. And also threatening targets over their careers or achievements or their funding or their visa status. All of those can be considered as incidents of academic bullying and harassment. So we have major issues in the field as well, in a way that we can't easily address academic bullying and harassment. So one of the main issue we have is that academic bullies are clever. They basically rarely leave any trace behind. Many of the actions are being done behind the closed doors. Even in some cases, they enforce targets to sign away their rights over their papers or intellectual properties. And you can imagine international students and minorities are more vulnerable to those behaviors. And the reason is that they have, for example, international students have language and cultural barriers, and also less support compared to the domestic students. There are many other issues. For example, we lack strong law against academic bullying and harassment. For example, in the United States, I had an opportunity to talk with many lawyers around the issue of academic bullying and harassment, and the outcomes were simple. The bullying and harassment in academia is unethical, but it's not illegal unless you can basically connect it to sexual harassment or discrimination or racism. The other problem we have is the lack of psychological knowledge. Basically, when you want to help a target to start healing processes, the knowledge about the various issues that bullying and harassment can cause to them is not there yet. The other issue we have is a lack of fair and unbiased internal investigation by the universities. And there are many reasons for that. One of the major reasons is that the internal members of the investigation committees are not accountable for their decisions. Even for the scandals of academic bullying and harassment, we barely see any statement from members of the investigation committee or internal committees that why they basically covered up for perpetrators for so long. Institutions have their reputations on stake as well, and they have limited amount of funding and options to basically provide to targets. The other issue is that bullies have basically connections within the department and even in the investigation committee, and the helpless nature of the target is another major issue. The other problem we have in the ecosystem is the willingness to tolerate among targets, and there are many reasons for that. For example, if a PhD student has spent a couple of years in the lab, or a junior faculty basically spend many years to basically get tenured. So if they get kind of targeted for bullying and harassment behavior, they try to use code of silence to basically don't destroy their careers. So they have fear of retaliations, fear of mobbing. And again, if it comes to minorities and international students, they have many more reasons to use the code of silence. And the last but not least complications in the process is the confidentiality of the outcomes. Unless it reaches to news outlets, the outcomes would remain confidential at institutional level. So now the question is that what targets do in this environment, fight, flight. Unfortunately, studies show that they tolerate the situation and have to deal with a huge amount and wide spectrum of side effects because of tolerating bullying and harassment behaviors. The sad reality is that it doesn't affect targets alone. It also affects their family members and people of the circle of their influences. For example, if a person is in the healthcare system, or if they are like medical doctors, those toxic environment can affect their decisions, their medical decisions. So we have studies showing that toxic behaviors in hospitals, for example, can increase the number of medical errors. So what happens is that even patients pay the price. And in addition to all of those, all of the scientific community will also pay the price, because academic bullying can slow down the progress of science. For example, by reducing the academic workforce. Now, many academics basically leave academia because of these behaviors and basically look jobs for other sectors. Or it can basically hinder the progress of star sciences and scientists. And we can see the evidence in the number of disruptive science discoveries that has been basically conducted in the past century. And as you see, recent Nature reports reveal that we have significant reduction in number of like disruptive science discoveries. It can also enhance the issue of file driver problem. And file driver problem means that scientists tend to only publish positive outcomes. And with the bullying behavior, they are encouraged actually to cherry pick data and also increase the file driver problem. And the last part is leaving targets unhealed. This is very important. I can't emphasize enough about the importance of this option, because when targets remain unhealed, there's a great risk that they do bullying behaviors when they get to the power position. And it's through a known psychological process called identification with an aggressor. So universities, instead of being a resource and basically place for producing science, they would be a resource for producing future bullies if we don't pay attention to that critical option. So now the question is that what has been done so far? So individual basically reporters or scientists try to kind of investigate the ecosystem and publish the outcomes of their findings. Different lab members did the same about like their experience and their insights about the academic bullying issues and the way that they can basically address that. We have also ran a global survey to better understand the contextual behaviors of academic bullying and also see the basically effects on international students. For example, Nature recently took part of our basically data and showed that which contextual behavior is more severe for international students compared to the domestic people. And the outcomes of our survey clearly showed that over 70% of the targets do not speak up. And there are many reasons for that. One reason is that the news that we see are very discouraging. For example, this is the latest, one of the examples of the head of the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, the story showed that he did sexual harassment and other types of bullying for few decades. And even there were a couple of complaints at the university level, nothing happened to him. When it reached to the news, then the professor was forced to be retired, and that's it. So you can imagine what kind of signals it can send to the scientific community. Perpetrators are protected, and targets needs to pay the price. And you will hear more about Susanne's case, which I think follow the same kind of pattern here. The other issue is the fear of retaliation or fear of visa cancellation or any type of indirect and direct consequences of speaking up. So we also had published over 700 anonymous narratives of the targets, and Science magazine basically took tens of those and basically published in a courier piece. Publishers can make also a great contribution in the field. The problem that they have is that they think that some of the issues like racism, academic harassment and bullying, and basically gender imbalances in science are out of the scope of many journals. But in reality, their audiences, and like I mentioned, the science progress, regardless of the discipline, can be affected by those behaviors and issues. So these three items needs to be considered by journal editors because they have a great role in increasing awareness about the issue. So after the case of George Floyd in the United States, for example, ACS Applied Materials and Interfaces published a piece titled Confronting Racism in Chemistry Journals. And then other journals of the American Chemical Society published the very same thing. And you know that based on the academic ethics, this may be considered as plagiarism because it's being republished, the same thing, the same author by different journal, but because it's for the sake of increasing awareness about the issue, this would be even considered as a positive reaction by the journal. Or as another example, we basically consider the reasons that we have a huge gap between number of male and female Nobel Prize laureates. And we basically did a huge analysis on the number of nominations and defined some reasons for that gap. And the piece was published in Lancet. Again, it's out of the scope of the Lancet, but because it was in the topics of the general interest, they were welcome to publish it. And the same thing happened in Angewandte Chemie. So we have some progresses, like I mentioned, between different stakeholders and different individuals. But the recent outcome from US National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine reported an interesting thing. They found out that even in the case of sexual harassment, that they have a strong educational platform and legal actions, they found little evidences that the number of or incidences of sexual harassment got significantly reduced. It sends a clear message that what we lack is interdependent actions of all stakeholders. This is what we need to truly and timely address academic bullying. For example, I talked a lot about why institutions do not have the interest in fairly and unbiasedly address academic bullying and harassment and support targets and face perpetrators. One of the reasons was the funding that perpetrators may bring to the university. So you can imagine if funding agencies didn't come in and interfere, then universities has less reasons to cover up for a bully. And we have a good example for that, which the Wellcome Trust funding agency in the UK basically took away funding from one of the perpetrators. Or if policymakers come into the equation and consider anti-bullying records of the universities in their reputation and their ranking system, that would be a great help. or we need to make a paradigm in the academic index to at least bring the common sense that academic measure is not academic goal. And the last but not least, we need a global committee, an external global committee that can audit the outcomes of the member of the internal investigation committees at the university. So they can basically access to the cases, they can audit over their findings and decisions and make them accountable. And this is not unique. This is not something new. We have the same thing in publishing ethics. For example, COPE, almost all of the scientific journals these days follow their guidelines about how to respond to allegations of like plagiarism, data fabrication, and so forth. So if that happens, then if we have basically interdependent response from all of the stakeholders, then the situation would be changed at the institutional level. For example, if you now look at the universities, they have great anti-bullying policies in policies, but not in action. There's a great gap. When someone basically speaks up, the response that they get is that the universities basically do not even follow their own guidelines. So we don't have that gap anymore. The sad reality right now is that even academic bullies at the university level, they are protected by public money because the target needs to cover all of their like legal expenses by themselves, but because the interest of the perpetrators and universities are kind of intertwined, basically perpetrators are being protected by university lawyers. And like I mentioned, if funding agencies comes in, then universities can generate more example of the successful investigation process over academic bullying and harassment. They can basically send positive signals to targets and also negative signals to perpetrators. So this alone can basically reduce the incidence of academic bullying. And then they can also provide resources to hit targets. So in order to make another kind of external resource for targets, we founded a nonprofit organization back in 2019 called the Academic Parity Movement. And the goal was very simple, to make the same human rights that apply outside the lab, to make it happen inside the lab as well. So we had three main goals. The short-term goal was to increase awareness among stakeholders. The midterm goal, which we started a few months ago, is to financially support targets to basically get the legal advice and also trauma expert sessions if they're needed. And the long-term goal is to basically create a platform that all of the stakeholders can work together. So we founded the Parity Movement, and we basically was fortunate to bring some core advisors, and we ran a survey, and we noticed that academic bullies, basically bullying does not affect all sciences equally. So there's a scientific discipline contextual behavior. So we basically reached out to many experts in different fields to better understand the contextual behaviors of bullying in each field and also in different cultures. So far, we tried to increase awareness by publishing over like 50 pieces in different journals and news outlets. We provided informal advice for over 700 targets, and we also started to publish targets, anonymous kind of stories that can be used by other targets. So to summarize, I basically covered the major root causes on academic bullying and the reasons that we have those root causes. And I also talked about like the side effects of academic bullying. One thing that I need to also emphasize is that if we don't address the toxic environment in academia, it can propagate to other sectors. So we will have the same problem in industry and in other sectors as we do, but the basically intensity of those toxic behaviors would be even higher in other sectors. And there are recent promising actions by different stakeholders, like I mentioned in UK, the Wellcome Trust made a great contribution in collaborating with universities to make them more responsible for making healthier environment. Here in the US, we have the same strategies from NIH and NSF. They basically make a department that targets can contact them directly, and they do independent investigation on the cases, and they basically may take funding from harassers, which also stop them to passing from one institution to another institution. Thank you so much for your time and consideration, and I pass the floor to Susanne to continue with her presentation. Thank you.